And a happy Saturday morning, brothers and sisters. It is Saturday, December the 3rd of 2016. And today on my time with you here on Facebook Live, as I join with you every day, and I hope you come here every day for that purpose, I want to reflect with you about someone whose birthday is today. She passed away 11 years ago, but it is a very special person, someone who, contrary to her own plans and desires, became very, very well known nationally and internationally, unfortunately because of the tragic circumstances of her death. I'm talking about Terri Schiavo, the woman from Florida who was brain injured and who was killed legally by being deprived of food and water. This was back in 2005 that she died. And I was very much involved in this case. I just want to give you some reflections about Terri's life and death because it continues to hold important lessons for us, important challenges for us as a church, as a nation, as a pro-life movement. Brothers and sisters, we are, again, today, December the 3rd. She was born on this day in 1963, so she would have been 53 years old today. And she grew up in the Philadelphia area with her brother Bobby, her sister Suzanne, her mom and dad, Bob and Mary Schindler. Bob, her dad, passed away some years after she did. He was a wonderful man. It was a privilege to know him. And now, of course, I get to see his mom, brother, and sister on a regular basis. And just this morning, emailed Bobby Schindler to let him know that I was thinking about him and the family today on Terri's birthday. Now, as I share with you some reflections here, let me point out our webpage about Terri. It's priestforlife.org, of course, /Terri, spelled Terri. So priestforlife.org /Terri, Terri. You will find a lot of information there, as well as photos and audio clips about the whole story of Terri's suffering and death and the moral controversy and the legal controversy surrounding it. My own involvement, that of many others. You'll hear, for example, there the homily that I delivered at her funeral. And that was something that was just unforgettable. The people who came there, and not only to mourn her tragic death, which was nothing less than a murder, but also to commit themselves to work to protecting other vulnerable people. What was the story in a nutshell? In a nutshell, it was this. In 1990, Terri had an accident that caused her to be brain injured. What exactly happened, we still do not know. Because the only people there were her and her husband Michael, who later became her estranged husband and who was in fact responsible for murdering her, as I will explain. But she was brain injured, and at first her whole family was helping her to recover from that brain injury. But then at a certain point, Michael took over all the medical decision-making, and even though Terri's mom and dad and brother and sister were all united, completely united, and ready and willing to care for Terri for the rest of her life and to allow Michael to walk away if he so chose. Nevertheless, and this now was after he hooked up with another woman, started another life with her, he insisted through the court system that Terri be deprived of food and water and therefore be starved and dehydrated to death. Now, let's get something clear, because the myths about this still persist. Terri wasn't dying. She did not have any kind of disease, and she did not have any kind of machines connected to her. So this was not a case of end-of-life decision-making. There are many cases, and this by itself is a big issue, of end-of-life decision-making, when there are various treatments available, various machines or operations available, and you have to begin to weigh, well, how much do we want to let this person's life continue, particularly if they are dying Do we constantly have to keep them alive? Do we have to use every machine, every intervention, every drug possible? And the answer to that is no, you don't have to use every means possible. You have to evaluate each one in the light of the concrete medical circumstances of that person at that time. But Terri didn't have any disease, and she wasn't dying. She was simply brain injured. She was at a lower level of functioning, wasn't able to speak normally like the rest of us, but how much she could have improved is a question, because she wasn't allowed to have the therapy that may have helped her improve, but even that is beside the point. The point is that some decided her life was not worth living and therefore had her killed. That's the point. Now, how did I get involved in this case? The family reached out to me because they saw me on television, and reached out to me and to Priests for Life and said, we would like you to help us bring some attention to Terri's case, because here we want to protect her, and Michael, her estranged husband, wants her killed. So could you please help us bring attention to this case? And we did. We helped bring attention to the case in the media, in the legislature. Eventually, Congress got involved. The President of the United States got involved. But most importantly, I want to share with you my observations of Terri herself, because interestingly, she was placed in a hospice in Pinellas Park, Florida, but nobody was allowed to see her. As the case began to become known and the controversy grew and ended up on the federal level, again, as I say, in Congress, and all these battles were going back and forth about whether to protect her, access to her was cut off. When the courts got involved, they had the family draw up a list of what people would be allowed in her room. Both the family, both sides, in other words, Michael Schiavo, her estranged husband, and her parents and siblings, were asked to present a set of names to the court of people who would be allowed in Terri's room. At that point, they put my name on that list. So I was one of a handful of people who was able to actually see Terri and see with my own eyes the condition that she was in. So I went to see her. Now, at this point, she wasn't able to swallow, nor was she being given any treatment or therapy for that. She wasn't able to swallow because of the brain injury. And so at feeding times, she was given a nutrition through a feeding tube. Not an extraordinary thing. And people were saying, in the mythology that developed around Terri's story, that she was a vegetable. Now, no person ever becomes a vegetable, but the idea that was circulating out there was she was just lying there motionless, unaware of her surroundings, unable to speak or to talk or to think or to do anything. Wasn't true. I went to see her, and she responded to me. I prayed over her, and when I started praying, she would close her eyes. When I came to the end of the prayer, she opened her eyes again. She followed me around the room with her eyes. I saw her laugh at her father's jokes. He was a real comedian, and he would bend down and kiss her, for example, and he had a mustache, and he would say, "Okay, Terri, here comes a tickle," and he would come and kiss her, and she would laugh. I saw her attempting to respond to her mother's questions. By any normal definition of the word, she was responsive. She was responsive in a way that made sense there in that room. Now, what kind of machines were in that room? There weren't any. She wasn't attached to any kind of life support. She was breathing on her own. Her heart was beating on its own. Her body was functioning on its own. She simply had an injury to her brain that inhibited certain kinds of functions. That's it. She wasn't dying of anything. There wasn't anything there keeping her alive. The reason she died was starvation and dehydration, which was ultimately, after a lot of back and forth and legal battles, which, as I say, reached the highest levels of government and the highest levels of international exposure in the media, nevertheless, the decision ended up being remove the food and remove the water. Now, let me give you an idea to what extreme this went. I was still allowed in her room right up until she died, but there were armed guards at the door of her room. This is a woman in a hospice in Pinellas Park, Florida. And there were 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5 people at the door, armed police officers I'm talking about, at the door and surrounding her bed. Now, why were they there, armed police officers? They wanted to make sure that neither I nor anybody else who came into the room gave Terri so much as a drop of water. Now let that sink in for a moment. By court order, armed police officers keeping a woman from getting a drop of water in a hospice in the United States of America. Not dying. Not dying. And again, as I said, and observed with my own eyes, responding to human voice, to jokes, to prayers. The night before she died, I was in that room for many hours, together with her brother and sister. By this point, she had not had a drop of water in 2 weeks. And she looked horrible. Now, meanwhile, the media was out there, and those who were on the side of Michael Schiavo were saying, oh, well, she's dying with dignity and in a very peaceful way. And I would come out of the room and go in front of the media cameras and say just the opposite. Because the look on her face, as I looked at her face for such a long time, I was trying to come up with the adjectives that best described it. And I'll tell you the 2 that came to mind. Horrified, sadness. That's the look that was on her face. Horrified sadness. Her eyes were open, and they were darting back and forth violently. I never saw anything like that. Darting back and forth violently. This was not a pretty sight. And irony of ironies, as she lay there dehydrating, with armed police officers making sure we didn't give her anything to drink, right next to her bed, practically right next to her head, was a vase of flowers filled with water. The flowers were in that vase, growing and flourishing, and Terri was lying next to that vase, dying for lack of water. And there we were in that room, and we spoke to her, and we assured her of the prayers of so many of you who were following all the events that were happening with her and speaking up for her life. We read scripture to her. Sometimes we just sat with her in silence, holding her hand. And at other times we sang. Because sometimes when words fail, and even silence fails, we have to resort to song. And I actually sang to her a number of the Latin chants that we know in the Catholic Church that have been with us for centuries. And as you may remember, if you followed this whole case, Terri was in her final stages of dying during Holy Week. So on Good Friday, as Christians gathered in churches throughout the world and reflected on Jesus dying on the cross and his mother Mary standing there with him as he went through that agony, there in a hospice in Pinellas Park, Florida, another innocent person was dying, and her mother, whose name is also Mary, was by her side, also suffering along with her. The irony is that the world was watching but couldn't see outside of that hospice. It looked like one of these fairs where you have all these booths set up with the different games and food concessions, except that they weren't games or concessions. They were media outlets. Media outlets from around the world and around the country were all there out on the street. I was going from one to the other, conducting interviews and explaining, just like I'm explaining now, what I saw in Terri's room. And here was the irony. All these cameras were there, and millions of people were watching and following the story, but nobody could see Terri. Access to her was cut off. Let me tell you why access to her was cut off. In order to let the other side, the murderers and their supporters, write their own narrative. That's why people were not allowed, cameras were not allowed to come in there. Because if cameras were allowed to come in there and you saw what I saw, this would have never been allowed to continue. But as it was, with people not able to see anything, they wrote their own narrative, the other side did, Michael Schiavo and his attorneys, who were very critical of me. Of course they were critical of me, because I was ripping the veil off of their lies. Lies like, oh, well, this is a peaceful and dignified death. It wasn't peaceful or beautiful or dignified in the least. It was a murder. And she was dehydrated to death, and this should never be allowed in a civilized society. And the myth continues not only about what happened to Terri. The myth continues, brothers and sisters, because so many still think that when a person is at a lower level of functioning, somehow their life is less valuable. There are those who still think that the amount of protection that we give to a human life depends on how productive or well-functioning it is. And that is the myth that we must continue to oppose and destroy, saying instead, with Pope St. John Paul II, that life is always a good, always a good. No matter how it may be afflicted or limited or burdened, it is always a good. The morning that Terri died, we were standing there in a little Christian store, which is actually right across the street from the hospice, and the owners of that store made that space available to me and to the family members during those last days of Terri's life, where we were able to go just for some quiet and for some sleep at night and for some refuge from all the turmoil that was going on. And I'll never forget being in that little room that morning when she died. We went in, we said prayers over her, of course. Then we came back into that room, and then we were told that Pope John Paul II had been given a feeding tube. These were the last days of his life as well. And if you may recall, he died 2 days later. The day that Terri died was Easter Thursday, and in the church's liturgical year, the week from Easter Sunday to the second Sunday of Easter, which is Divine Mercy Sunday, is all considered as one day. It's the octave of Easter. So literally, you could say liturgically that Terri died on Easter Day. It was Easter Thursday. Pope John Paul II died on Easter Saturday, actually in the evening on the vigil of Divine Mercy Sunday, a feast that he himself instituted, a devotion that he himself promoted so strongly. And the proximity of the death of Terri and of Pope St. John Paul II was just something that had us speechless, overwhelmed. He had spoken out in regard to Terri's life, and of course the Vatican clarified the fact that giving somebody food and water isn't medical treatment, and therefore it can never be considered something extraordinary that you don't have to do. You don't come to the point where you don't have to feed or give water to somebody. Now, obviously, in the last stages of dying, if the body is no longer accepting it, well, then that doesn't even become a question anymore as to whether you should give it if the body itself is rejecting it. But so long as the body is processing food and water, you don't deprive somebody of that. I want to conclude by singing with you what I sang with Terri. Not only the night before she died, but the morning that she died, just minutes before she left this earth. And it is the hymn of the resurrection. Oh, before I get to that, though, let me tell you one more thing. If you go to Terri's grave, you're going to see an amazing thing on her stone. And again, you can see this on our website. And let me remind you again, at priestforlife.org/Terri, Terri. You will see all the things I'm saying right now. You'll be able to hear my homily at Terri's funeral. You'll be able to hear other reflections. But you'll also be able to see a picture of her gravestone. And I want to point out what you will see there. Rather than just two dates, the day that she was born, which is today, December 3rd, and the day that she died, March 31st of 2005, you see a third date in between. the date of her brain injury, which was February 25th, 1990. But here's what the stone says, and this was at the instructions of Michael Schiavo, her estranged husband who had her killed. Terri's gravestone says her name, of course, and then it says born December 3rd, 1963. Then it says departed this earth February 25th, 1990, the day of her brain injury. And then it says at peace, March 31st, 2005. Think about that for a moment. This is the claim, the false claim, that if you get brain injured, you're no longer here on earth. And isn't that a convenient way of escaping responsibility from those who it might be a little bit difficult to care for? It's selfish, it's heretical, it's dangerous, and it's wrong to think that people who are disabled in some way are not people, are not really here among us, here on earth. Instead, the reality, the virtue of solidarity, the truth of the culture of life recognizes all of us as being here and recognizes all of us as responsible for one another, whether we're healthy or sick, whether we're dependent or independent, no matter what is happening to us. Yes, we're here on this earth. It is wrong to say she departed this earth in 1990. Who was it in the bed who was laughing at her father's jokes, responding to her mother's questions, and responding to the prayers I said over her? Who was it in that bed? That was our sister. That was Terri. And as for those who say, oh, the government should never have gotten involved in all of this, what do you think the purpose of government is? The purpose of government is the protection of human life. Of course Congress got involved. Of course the president got involved. Of course we got involved. Because this is the matter of an innocent human life being protected. If a government cannot do that, it has abandoned and violated the entire purpose of its existence. So let nobody start complaining, as so many have done over the years. Oh, Congress should not have gotten involved in this private matter. It's not a private matter when a fellow citizen is being starved and dehydrated to death by court order. That's a public matter. And everyone in the public has got to speak up about that. We did, and we will continue to do so for those who are in similar situations as Terri. And that's where I want to bring your attention to lifeandhope.com. That is the website that Terri's family and the network that they have established to help other families in these similar situations can be found. Lifeandhope.com. Terri's Life and Hope Network. What a beautiful name that is. And that is somewhere that I also invite you to go. Check them out. And it's a network of interested people, clergy, attorneys, doctors, people who can assist those who may be in similar situations or families who may be facing similar problems as Terri's family faced in this tragic case that concluded 11 years ago. Also, the book about Terri's life, A Life That Matters, check that out also on, again, my webpage on Terri is priestforlife.org/Terri, spelled Terri. So let me sing with you now, brothers and sisters. When I was in Terri's room, I sang to her the Easter proclamation. It's called The Sequence. You hear it just before the gospel at every Catholic church around the world on Easter Sunday morning. And it is a hymn announcing the resurrection of Christ, because there, in that absurd moment of the culture of death in her room, as those police officers made sure nobody gave her a drop of water, we saw this culture of death. We felt it. It was oppressing us so vividly. And there was nothing there better to do than to proclaim that Christ has conquered that. He has conquered the power and the culture of death. Because he has conquered it, we speak. We're never to be silent in the face of the culture of death. Never. I asked the police officers who were there in that room, have you ever seen anything like this before? And their response to me was no, and I hope I never do again. And I asked myself, and I was asked, have you ever felt like you do here before? sitting in front of this woman that you can't even give a drink of water to. And I said, yes, I have felt like this before. I felt like this every time I've stood in front of an abortion facility, where, just like this adult is being legally killed, these children are legally killed by the thousands every day. And those of us who go there and try to save them, we're the ones that end up becoming the bad guys. We're the ones that are doing wrong somehow. We're interfering with somebody else's choice. No, we're trying to save the lives of babies who are about to be slaughtered, just like we were trying to save the life of Terri, who was being dehydrated. Do you know that there were 2 children who tried to bring her a cup of water? In obedience to our Lord's words, whatever you do or whatever you fail to do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do or you fail to do to me. They brought her a cup of water. The children were arrested for trying to go into that hospice with water for Terri. These children were arrested. And when the case came before a judge, the judge ordered them to write a letter saying they were sorry for what they did and they would never do it again. You know what they did? They wrote a letter, all right. But they said they were not sorry and that they would do it again. And that's the attitude you and I have to have, whether it's saving the unborn children from abortion or saving the disabled like Terri from a terrible dehydration. Yes, we will speak up. Yes, we will intervene to save them. And no, we will not compromise with evil. So I sang the hymn of the resurrection. What it says is, to the Paschal victim Christians, raise your songs of praise. Christ, the innocent one, the innocent lamb has bled for the sheep. The life and death were locked in an awesome struggle. Life's captain died, but now reigns victorious. And then it goes on to say, tell us, Mary, what did you see along the way? I saw the tomb of the now living Christ. I saw the burial vestments. Christ, my hope, has arisen. He goes before you into Galilee. Yes, we know that Christ is risen. Do have mercy on us, O victorious King. Amen. Alleluia. So let me sing with you now, and let's profess our faith together now in the resurrection of Christ. Let me sing for you now what I sang for Terri. And let these words, proclaiming that Christ is risen, enable us to recommit ourselves right now, to stop at no sacrifice, and to give everything, including our own lives, for the protection of our brothers and sisters, whether they are in the womb or in a hospice like Terri was. The Victimae Paschali Laudes. Victimae Paschali Laudes, imolem Christiani. Agnus redemit oves Christus innocens Patri, reconciliavit peccatores. Morser vita duello conflixere mirando, dux vitae mortus regnat vivus. Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via, sepulchrum Christi viventis, et gloriam vidi resurgentis, angelicos testes, sudarium et vestes. Surrexit Christus spes mea, precedet suos in Galilea. Scimus Christum surrexisse a mortuis vere, tu nobis victor rex miserere. Amen. Alleluia. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for your commitment to life. Thank you, Mary and Bobby and Suzanne, Terri's family, for continuing to witness to her life and to the dignity of every life. Thanks to all who speak up for the vulnerable. If you want to leave a message for Terry's family, do so right here. Leave a comment for me. I'll make sure that they see it. And let's make sure that we stay in contact with one another, because our defenseless brothers and sisters need our voice, our defense, our action on their behalf. And we will win this victory over the culture of death, because, as we just proclaimed in song, Christ indeed is risen. Happy birthday, Terri. May we never forget. God bless you all. Have a good weekend.